On May 23, 1774, just 5 months after a group of colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians famously raided 3 ships in Boston and dumped their chests of tea into that harbor, a group of rebels from Chestertown, Maryland, boarded a vessel known as the Brigantine Gettys and dumped its shipment of East India tea into the Chester River. Today, this historic event is commemorated every Memorial Day weekend to celebrate what has come to be known as the Chestertown Tea Party. Walking the streets of this quaint Eastern Shore community of 5,000, it is hard to imagine that during the colonial period, Chestertown was one of the most important ports on the Chesapeake Bay. Ships regularly sailed up the Chester River bringing goods from all corners of the globe, and local merchants made fortunes by sending grain and wheat harvested from the region's rich farmlands and sending them to the West Indies in exchange for sugar, molasses, and rum.
The people in port towns were a very broad cross-section of all economic strata. They were workers, there were slaves, there were merchants, there were people from farms, people coming right off the ship from England. There were people who sympathized with England who stood to benefit from aligning themselves with British economic policies, and there were also people who, after 100 years of living in relative freedom from interference from Britain, who resisted any attempts to interfere with their livelihood, and that's exactly what started happening in the 1760s with some of the acts that were forced upon the colonists, in their view, by British Parliament.
These were men like Thomas Smythe and Thomas Ringgold, guys who came from old Eastern Shore families, already old at that point, who'd been planting tobacco for over a century, and then in the mid-18th century switched over to farming wheat, and that was when the real money was made around here, shipping grain off to Europe, to the West Indies, all over the Atlantic world. Others of them made money trading various goods around the Atlantic economy, and others made money importing slaves as well.
Even George Washington himself made 8 known visits to Chestertown, eventually lending his name to Washington College, a private liberal arts institution on the northern end of town.
Well, the reason that George Washington and other patriot leaders came through Chestertown was that this place was basically kind of a rest stop on the I-95 of colonial America. It was the main thoroughfare of north-south travel in colonial times. People would travel by boat and by road to get from Virginia to places like Philadelphia and Boston. In Revolutionary times, that became very, very important because these patriot leaders were traveling back and forth, going to the Continental Congresses, going when George Washington went up to take command of the Continental Army. He came through Chestertown and he stayed in a tavern here overnight and presumably met the local leaders and had dinner with them and discussed the issues of the day. And it would have made this also sort of a point on the information highway, a very exciting place to be in this very exciting time.
The relative peace and prosperity experienced by the merchants of Chestertown in the first half of the 18th century would come under heavy strain following the 7 Years' War. In order to pay off England's war debt, King George III and Parliament decided to raise revenue by taxing the American colonists. This decision led to a series of unpopular duties that culminated with the passing of the Tea Act of 1773. On December 16th of that year, rebels in Massachusetts openly demonstrated their contempt for this act by dumping a recently arrived shipment of East India tea into Boston Harbor. News of this shocking event reached Maryland on January 6, 1774, when a brief eyewitness account was published in the Maryland Gazette. King George III and Parliament reacted to the colonists' brazen act of defiance by ordering the closing of the port of Boston until full payment was received for all of the dutiable tea that had been destroyed. When news of the Boston Port Act began to reach Maryland in May of 1774, local leaders reacted with shock and outrage. On May 18, 1774, a number of Chestertown's town leaders met to discuss the community's response to the Boston Port Act. After a lively and heated discussion, they penned what has come to be known as the Chestertown Resolves.
Gentlemen! Gentlemen, the committee has come to a resolution. Resolved, that no duties or taxes can constitutionally be imposed on us, but by our own consent, given personally or by our representatives.
Well, you have to remember that these merchants in Chestertown were people who, even though they lived in what might seem a little bit like a backwater, felt a really strong connection to the rest of the world. And they were trading independently with all different British colonies and the mother country and foreign countries as well. And they saw anything that restricted their ability to trade, they saw as a real imposition on their liberties. They saw as a form of tyranny and enslavement. And they were ready to resist it almost by any means necessary. Although there were some holdouts as well. There were people who felt strongly we shouldn't go towards war, we shouldn't let this degenerate into violence. We are strong and loyal British subjects, and this is something that they actually reiterated in the Chestertown Resolves. They said, we are loyal subjects of the King of Great Britain, but we also protest against this tyranny.
Resolved, that the Act of the British Parliament subjecting the colonies to a payment of the duty on tea for the purpose of raising a revenue in America is unconstitutional, oppressive, and calculated to enslave the Americans. Resolved, therefore, that whoever shall willfully and knowingly sell, buy, or consume, or in any way assist in the sale, purchase, or consumption of any tea imported subject to a duty, he or they shall be stigmatized as enemies to the liberties of America.
There were a lot of Chestertown residents who were loyalists as well. There was actually an entire regiment raised during the Revolution of loyalist forces by a man here in Chestertown. So this revolutionary movement was a civil war as much as it was any other kind of war. And it was really brother against brother and neighbor against neighbor.
Resolved that we will not only steadily adhere to the foregoing resolves, but will endeavor to excite our worthy neighbors to a like patriotic conduct. And whoever amongst us shall refuse his concurrence, we will mark him out as inimical to the liberties of America, an unworthy member of our community, and a person not deserving our regard. Resolved that the foregoing resolves be printed, that our brethren in this and other colonies may know our sentiments as they therein are contained. Signed by the order of the committee.
The tantalizing postscript to the Chestertown Resolves refers to a ship owned by William Geddes, customs collector for the port of Chestertown. The brigantine Geddes had recently arrived in the Chesapeake Bay with a shipment of dutiable tea, a portion of which had already been landed in Annapolis. Apparently energized by this recent development, the Committee of Town Leaders met again on May 23rd to discuss what further measures might be taken.
The people who typically operated those customs facilities were loyal British subjects. Geddes certainly would have been one of those people, because in order for the British government to collect the taxes, they had to rely on people who were ostensibly in favor of their economic policies, including the establishment of duties on things like tea.
The clues are fairly slim, and it's hard to say exactly what happened. A lot of the story of the Chestertown Tea Party is based on oral tradition here in the area, which is something that's very strong, and families here do pass stories down from generation to generation. But we can sort of imagine fairly easily that here was this ship, the masts of this ship kind of looming right there in the harbor of the Chester River, and the men were gathered for their meeting of the Sons of Liberty and looking practically out the windows of the house where they were meeting, seeing this ship with the hated tea on board. And who knows, their meeting may even have been enlivened with some non-dutiable beverages, and they may have ended up deciding that some action needed to be taken.
Today, the Chestertown Tea Party Festival celebrates all of the things that make this small Eastern Shore community so special. Its unique history, its strong sense of community, and its commitment to preserving the area's rich heritage.